This video has been brought to you by the generous support of all of my patrons. If you'd like to support the channel, please take a look at the link in the video description. Thank you. Let's do it. Let's do it. Bakuman's built different. For those of you who aren't aware, Bakuman is a manga and anime that revolves around two young mangaka who are, for somewhat different reasons, aiming for the top. It's an exploration of artistry, where it comes from, why people struggle for it. And it kind of talks about manga in a pretty frank setting, including the sacrifices people make for their works. So, what's going on with Bakuman? Why is it built different? Bakuman is surprisingly conservative in a general sense. Both the manga and anime are willing to bring up crucial questions of gender and labor, but it's somewhat uneasy about drawing lines in the sand. For instance, its women are independent artists who are still paradoxically quite reliant on their male counterparts. It depicts labor as ingloriously body-breaking, yet it's unwilling to prescribe any real structural solutions, and it speaks of artistry and struggle, but not from the perspective of doujinshi, indie scenes, and magazines, but instead focus almost entirely on the perspective of one of the more corporate and mainstream venues of manga making. Now, there are reasons as to why this is the case, but this video isn't about those reasons. This video is about one subject in which Bakuman does seem to draw a line in the sand. See, one of the later arcs revolves around Nanamine. He's this guy who seems to be this new prodigal writer, the classroom of truth, but it turns out that Nanamine isn't a sole creator. He's making content collaboratively with input from others, and then foists it onto the magazine as his own work. Protagonists, Mashiro and Takagi, are justifiably angry, and after a duel of the rankings, Nanamine is, spoilers, beaten, and he ends up seeing the errors of his ways. His art can be seen as a triumph of artistic expression over paint-by-numbers committeeism. That art, real art, will prevail over the cynical dregs of consumerism. In some ways, it's a reaffirmation that the current system is the one that works, that this business platform will fall under the weight of its own shoulders. But let's hang on that word for a second. Platforms. Because this wasn't the only time this subject shows up. See, in chapter 21, Miyoshi, Takagi's partner, decides she wants to be a writer, so she starts to pen cell phone novels. Now, this is interesting because, well, aside from my personal interest in platforms like Shousetsuga ni Naro, Shousetsu, Let's Become a Novelist. It's the big isekai website, right? Platforms as generators of literature have been around for quite a while. In the early 90s, Yasutaka Tsutsui, the author of Paprika and The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, might have actually incorporated feedback from online readers, though it's not entirely sure to what extent, for his interactive work, Gaspard in the Morning. And platforms would play a role in the last arc. Mashiro and Azuki's relationship was doxed on a bulletin board, which ultimately ended up affecting her popularity, and that served as the series' climax. So if we think about it alongside what happened with Nanamine, there's this imagination of platforms as this thing that's been around for a long time, is kind of like interceptors and interferences. To Bakuman, platform technologies is seen as somewhat antagonistic, that they come off as dilutions of something more meaningful, more pure, and that it seeps into works we make and consume, which is kind of strange if you think about it. Because for all of their talks about artistry and struggle, Bakuman is pretty supportive of, media mix and consumerism. I mean, they want the anime, That's the whole point. She's going to voice a character, and then they're going to have the anime adaptation. They're going to get married, and it's going to be end. Everything comes together because of the anime adaptation. It's really when we get to platforms that the line starts to get drawn, that's strange, that compromises artistic vision, that's uncontrollable. So what's going on? What happened? And what's platforms got to do with Japan?
I was preparing a Japanese version of the anime media mix, and it was going to be published by Kadokawa. And in order to do some of the research that I did in the late 2000s, I was given a chance to do some interviews, including with the CEO of the company, who's this person named Kadokawa Tsuguhiko. And I was interested in asking questions about anime, about the media mix. And all Tsuguhiko was interested in really was talking about platforms and contents. There's many different definitions, and I tend to use three. One is a hardware definition, where we think of things like game consoles as platforms. The second is more like social media, so places like YouTube or Facebook are platforms where one can just post what one wants to. And then the third is a transactional model or economic model of platform, which is a place where people can do exchanges. So the Amazon's bookseller market is usually a key example of this. Even YouTube is a transactional platform because it provides videos and sells ads at the same time. So it's taking on these sort of two roles. And platform is something like a digital support for something that we used to call film or manga or novels. And what these collectively cultural goods have become called is content.
Yeah, we often think of platforms as spaces in which things come together and, something occurs. We see Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these places are platforms. And on these platforms, we've got arguments, news, ideas, discourse. It's all generated there.
This is the biggest transformation that we've had in terms of communicating with consumers in our lifetime.
But it wasn't always like that. Historically, a lot of people trace the term platform actually back to computers, that the computer platform was where a lot of machinery comes together, some of it very expensive right now, to create a space in which things are done. You play video games, do Excel spreadsheets, make videos. But if we trace the history of the modern platform, especially through management studies, a different genesis point starts to emerge. If we think of platforms as more so where a whole whack of actors and resources come together, we can broadly trace this back actually to the manufacturing ethos of cars, specifically one manufacturer. Toyota's lean manufacturing system was, in this case, an early iteration of modern platforms. It would use similar underbodies for several vehicles. It emphasized, and still emphasizes, a continual improvement process known as Kaizen, and it heavily focused on core elements of automobile manufacturing to perfect its logistics. Automobile manufacturing isn't just an industrial endeavor. It isn't just a product that we make and then deliver, but it's so heavily emphasized on frameworks. It becomes a space in which standards and protocols come together. And it was for that reason that modern platform theory actually cites automotive manufacturing as a lot of its genesis points. So, if this is true, then the contemporary understanding of platforms didn't come from the United States and it didn't come from computers. It came from cars. And it came from Japan. So, how do we get from cars to here? Why do we think of platforms the way we do? Well, it turns out there's another term. So let's talk about contents.
In North America in the mid-90s, companies like Microsoft started talking about cultural goods as content. And around the same time in Japan, this word was imported as well and pluralized, so it became kontentsu. I always talk about contents when I talk about Japan because it's always discussed in the plural. And essentially, this term builds on this earlier 1980s. People were talking about softo or software, which is like a kind of cultural software, which is anything from a manga to a novel could be called software. But it's essentially a transposable form of culture. So we think about today, we're not filmmakers, we're content producers. We're not TV producers or video makers, we're content producers. And this is the origin of the term contents, which comes again from 1980s soft to the 1990s contents. And today, really the two key aspects of our cultural environment are made up in the business, from a business perspective at least, by content, which is the things on screen, and then platforms, which are the sort of vehicles of delivery for things on screen.
Yeah, and of course, contents exist in this array, right? Having been generated on platforms in what's known as a platform economy. So Mark, can I get you to field as to what the hell that is?
It's a new term to describe the power of things that we call platforms, whether it be Amazon, Crunchyroll, Netflix, and so on cultural production, but also on the economy in general. We have these terms like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, which is called FANG. It's a stock market term, but it's a way to describe the power that these platforms have on our everyday life, but also on the cultural life and economic life of the contemporary world. And this is where I get the term platform economy from, is from people, generally economists, who are noting these changes and noting the rise of platforms. But I'm also very interested, because I was interested in anime, in the effects of this on cultural production, including things on the effects of platforms on animators. On the anime side, what interested me is the sort of industry of producing anime. So how does anime get produced, and how does it get distributed, and how does it change over time? And so this led me to really become interested in platforms as a main means of distributing anime. So many of us who are not in Japan or do not live in Japan don't have access to television. We're getting our anime via Crunchyroll, or it could be Netflix, it could be Amazon. And so these video streaming platforms, or SVODs as they're sometimes called, streaming video on demand, become ways in which we watch anime in a transnational context. Even within Japan, many of the services offered to view anime are these streaming video on demand platforms. So this is how I went from one to the other, and partly by talking to people who are in the anime industry, who I wasn't concerned about platforms at the time, but they were really concerned about it because they saw it as the future battleground for how anime is going to be shown and how it's going to be streamed. For there's these licensing battles over between like Google and Netflix, and so they have deep pockets. Chinese streaming platforms are also starting to produce anime as well, and that's an interesting moment for anime production. That this is a content, if you will, like anime is a content that is being fought over. I guess that's the way, via the anime transformations in the anime industry, I come to something like the platform. And my book, The Platform Economy, ends the two last chapters. One is on Nico Nico Video, so really rethinking what an anime distribution platform might look like. And the last one is on Line, WeChat, KakaoTalk, and other apps that are really impacted by a visual culture of anime where there's a lot of characters. Even Line has character goods in the Line Friends store. And thinking about the future of anime for me is really thinking the future of platforms and where they're going.
So this is a brief overview of platforms and contents and whatnot, but this has so far been all in general. So let's go back to the other part. Why Japan?
I researched Japan, so I find it endlessly fascinating, but Japan's really interesting because they developed what is the earliest paid model of content. So I became interested in how in the early days of the web, things were free, right? Google's free, and the news was free, weather was free. We became really used to this idea that the web is free.
Yes, you can get free internet access, and here are a few ways you can do it.
And of course, there have been criticisms of this. It means you're the product, right? There's this sort of advertising model that goes along with it.
That piece of content speaks to me. That's profound. Those are big, big numbers.
Even in North America, Canada, where I live, we started subscribing to things like Netflix. Instead of torrenting things, we would pay for subscription fees. Same thing with newspapers. We would pay subscription fees. So I became interested in how this subscription model was rejuvenating itself. And Japan is one of the first places that had two things. One is a mobile internet service that people used extensively. So starting in 1999, this service called iMode comes online, and it has a kind of mass take-up. People are using it. By 2 years later, 30 million people are using iMode. And the second is iMode really establishes this subscription model of the internet where everything is paid for. So your weather, if you want weather, you pay for it. If you want news, you pay for it. If you want to book a plane ticket, there's a fee associated with that. And iMode allows all these things to be done, but it's also instituting this kind of paid model of the internet.
What we have here is a shift to thinking of things as an ecosystem. We're not just looking at something being delivered from a creator to a reader, but we're starting to see something a bit more orbital. We're starting to see things hovering around a business space. But we've got to be really careful, because this isn't necessarily an epical or dramatic shift. In fact, iMode wasn't actually the first one to attempt to do this. Funny enough, iMode had its own influences. Its platform model drew from magazine advertisements and, well, more amusingly, convenience stores. In fact, to paraphrase David Lynch, the cell phone or smartphone can't beat a lot of media on screen size or performance.
It's such a sadness that you think you've seen a film on your fucking telephone. Get real.
But it can beat them in terms of accessibility and ubiquity. And the convenience store analogy is exactly what Docomo VP Enoki Keiichi says, that unlike department stores, which have specialized goods where you visit once in a while and spend a lot of money, convenience stores have limited options, but you go there every day. So something similar is happening with content and how we approach narrative, stories, and contents, where the constant access to it is what matters, that even if that content is in some ways limited. So in this sense, iMode is a kind of harbinger of the modern day platform economy, and it was signaling this well before iPhones and Android phones.
And one of the other big content of that time was games, video games, mobile games. And so Japan really becomes a pioneer in a paid model of the internet, kind of experience of the internet as mediated by your mobile phone. And it becomes the sort of place where something like mobile gaming starts. And mobile gaming is, by the early 2000s, is the main thing that people do, and they do it on a subscription basis. So if you like a particular game, you subscribe to it. Each month you pay a fee in order to keep playing. And so this becomes a real model for things like Apple's iPhone and Google's Android operating system. So iOS and Android are essentially versions of iMode that instead of having a flip phone as an interface, you have a flat kind of rectangular slab of glass. But aside from the form factor, they're almost entirely the same in terms of the system. Now we all have, assuming everyone has a phone, you're most likely to have either an Apple phone or an Android sort of version phone. And to me, it became really interesting to trace that history, to say where this came from, how iMode gets eclipsed even in Japan, but we don't really remember it as something that formed all of our mobile environments, our platform experiences. And the mobile phone has become so central to our experience of media.
This is really crucial. iMode is a mobile internet platform that marries two primary actors, the mobile user and the business, and it maintained itself through transactions. It was, in effect, similar to the Google Play Store or Apple App Store. But it preceded both of these stores by a decade. Now, this is even more impressive given that it had a massive rollout, but what iMode was selling wasn't necessarily just a paywall version of the mobile internet. but it was an attempt at a win-win infrastructure to connect handsets, networks, gateways, and users, all as kind of contents. In other words, the platform isn't just a delivery vehicle for contents, but it becomes a substrate upon which more contents emerges. Now, Mark's already mentioned the case of Line, the messenger app, which exploded because it was vital as a disaster response tool during the Tohoku tsunami in 2011. 311. I don't know why I smile. But if you look at Line now, it's not just a messaging app, it has its own content portals. And it's funny because this reminds me of the most famous 311 anime. Have you ever thought about how your name is fixated on communications and outreach? I mean, phones, books, screens, everything in that movie is mediated. Everything goes through some sort of infrastructure. And that infrastructure is shaping the way in which characters are relating to each other through space and time. But it's also a film, right? It's a story that draws heavily upon a post-disaster platform to shape its narrative. Narratives. Your Name is an example of a story so deeply intertwined in a world of platforms that direct conversation, unfettered by machinery, is its climactic arc. And yet, it still argues for the necessity of communicated platforms, because it's influenced by arguably the disaster communicated platform. But the great irony is that only a few years later, that platform would then go on to create its own content portals. So just as Your Name is a story about platforms, some of its subject matter, Line, would go on to become a platform for stories. And to go back to Bakuman, this is why Nanamine's failed project is so fascinating. His ideas isn't just some sleazy guy taking advantage of input and throwing it against the wall, which, to be fair, kind of is. But it's also emerged out of this I-mode mentality, where a cluster of actors come together in what they perceive as a mutual benefit, and it's all in the sake of generating content. This is a mentality that emerged out of Japan as a platform superpower. In the previous video, we talked about Haruhi and MPD Psycho, but it was often framed as discussions about characters and worlds. How do I get into the world of Haruhi and MPD Psycho? And how does that affect my reading of it? And what sorts of ways can these worlds reflect on their own status, well, as worlds? But when we get to platforms, that becomes even more abstract, because what you read is now affected by what you read on. So we're not talking about things confined to a simple imagined world anymore, but that these worlds are just, they're just more contents. It's no longer a situation where you can find your favorite works at X store or Y site, but rather X store and Y site is starting to generate the content you're looking for. In a way, it's a very cultural thing, that these elements are constantly growing and being nurtured on these platforms. At the same time, it makes understanding individual texts kinda difficult, because works become byproducts of places. The short, operatic lines of cell phone novels, the vertical fluidity of webtoons, the Nico Nico lines, they all play a direct role in shaping how narratives are created, but also how you consume them. And these places have an interest in connecting content producers and content consumers. For a price, of course. And this comes from the late 90s with I-mode. But there's also something else to mention, because for all of I-mode's similarities with the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store, there is something it did lack: a global reach. Because when we get to American platforms like Facebook and Amazon and Twitter, they do have a global reach, and that brings up a really important consequence. So Mark, can I get you to describe what platform imperialism is?
One of the things that really motivated this research to start was a concern that what does it mean for Japanese publishers, and this is talking to publishers, editors, other people in the Japanese cultural industries, what does it mean that publishers have to put their novels from their publishing house on Amazon Kindle? And is there going to be a kind of transformation in what's acceptable and not, because Amazon is an American company and their cultural mores don't match with those of Japan, so they might start editing things out that otherwise would be circulated in Japan. And it's a concern of a bit about who gets to make decisions about cultural production and where do those decisions get made.
However, we did start getting some word from publishers yesterday. Yesterday, J-Novel Club and Yen Press both came forward to make statements that they had actually spoken to Amazon, and they had both been told by Amazon that the titles in question no longer met content guidelines. What exactly that means, how exactly that was determined, is still pretty much completely unknown.
And platform imperialism is really the idea that, like, what does it mean that Google, Apple, Facebook, even Twitter to some degree, Netflix for sure, are American companies operating all around the world and essentially mediating cultural content from different locations in the world?
Not us, not anybody. What Netflix is doing is making content to support a platform. We, as in Disney, are making content to tell great stories.
So for me, it was really like, what is anime going to look like where it's all on Netflix, not on Japan-specific platforms?
現在 Netflix で配信中のブルーピリオドはもう見ましたか?
And so one of the platforms I was really interested in was Nico Doga, or Nico Nico Video, which is a really unique platform. It started around 2007 and has comments scroll over a screen. So if you watch any anime, you've seen this, because anime often refer back to Nico Nico Video as one of the interface models. And when people are using a computer, they're looking at computers with comments scrolling over the screen. So Nico Video is, for me, a really interesting place to think about, okay, what's a Japan-specific model of an interface? And now these interfaces have expanded. There's Bilibili in China. There's other, even Twitch, you could say, has sorts of interface elements that are similar to this.
You want the fucking truth? There is no bridge. I lied.
But what is a Japan-specific platform that might be a natural home for anime and even manga, where you could read manga on this platform? And how does it relate to platforms like Netflix, where the user experience is just this kind of clear interface that doesn't have any comments on screen, doesn't even really give you the chance to comment? So platform imperialism, and this is really developed nicely by this scholar from Simon Fraser University, Dao-Yon Jin, is really the idea that these American powers are having increasing impact on the cultural lives of everyone around the world.
Platforms, they are not separated from their government because they are their primary engines for their digital economy.
And we should all be concerned, whether you're in the US or whether you're in Indonesia, about the mediators of your cultural experience. And so for me, platform imperialism was really a way of grappling with this power dynamic of mostly American platforms having increasingly cultural impact all around the world.
So for somebody who's interested in anime and manga, what does all of this discussion about platforms and contents have to do with it? What are some of the consequences?
So there's an expansion of where anime criticism happens, and that's a welcome expansion and transformation, really. And there's other places in which people debate what happens in a particular anime, and platforms sort of facilitate this wider discussion that maybe used to happen at conventions, but couldn't really happen unless you're in anime clubs. And now anime clubs have become kind of platform mediated. And the other aspect is really like, where is anime seeable or viewable? And honestly, when I started my research, I really had to depend on more torrenting. I know there's debates around this, but this was the way that I was able to see anime that otherwise would be unseeable unless I went to Japan or went via bootleg videos available in other countries. And so anime has become a more viewable medium, and this, I think, is also made it more mainstream, I may say. I'm not sure if I'm right in this, but that obviously my Netflix recommendations are geared towards me, but I see a lot of anime on my Netflix recommendations. And so having a mainstream platform, Netflix, make anime visible, yeah, maybe it's an extension of those are like Anime Time and something like Cartoon Network, but maybe it's also a greater democratization of where anime can be seen.
But let's kind of end where we started off with. I started off with Bakuman, but I didn't talk too much about how it was marketed and sold to its audience. I spoke about what was happening in the story, and more specifically, what these specific events in the story were. Throughout this video, you might think, okay, well, sure, but that's all back-end stuff, right? Come on, I mean, that's all marketing and management, so this is really going to affect the way in which, I consume stories, right? Well, maybe, but I think it will. We're seeing platforms become increasingly crucial actors in anime production, and if they want to push for specific things or methods, we might start seeing shifts because of these platforms. And they do affect the way in which content is not only produced, but also kind of received. But, yeah. And I do apologize that this video is just going to kind of end. But it's because platforms themselves haven't really ended. They're still here, they're still ongoing, they're going to morph and mutate. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. So whether you believe that platforms affect us or you, readers or creators, is, something I can't really convince you because they're so ubiquitous, it's hard to measure exactly what it is they do or shape, in my opinion. But yeah, if you haven't yet, don't forget to like the video. Please leave a comment in the comments section. Hit the bell notification if you haven't. Sometimes YouTube does not notify. If you'd like to support the channel, check me out on Patreon. Yes, thank you very much for taking a look at this video. How much of this section is ironic?